This lecture will focus on the years following the Civil War when we were trying to figure out how to bring the country back together and fighting over how to do that best. So obviously the South is where most of the troubles were with after the Civil War. There were just a lot of different issues going on. With all of the land being completely torn apart, the value of the land had fallen a lot. Okay, so it just wasn't as valuable as it was before, and Confederate money, which they had been working with for many years now, was completely worthless. That government didn't exist. There was nobody to back up that money, and so that Confederate money was not worth anything. Also in the South, about 2/3 of the entire transportation system was destroyed. Roads, railroads, canals, and bridges and things like that were destroyed. Dozens of bridges were destroyed. Hundreds of miles of railroad track was useless. Approximately, like I said, 2/3 of all of the transportation was destroyed in the South. Okay, and last but really not least, one of the bigger things was there were no slaves anymore, and so with no slaves to do the work on the farms, the South wasn't making any money. That most of their money that they got as a group came from the output of these farms, and they couldn't keep up with it now. There weren't enough people. They had not adapted and used technology because they didn't need to, right? The slaves were free at that point because they were just being born into the families, and you don't have to buy the new technology. So Congress had to figure out, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do Reconstruction? And Reconstruction is just this idea of rebuilding the country. So that means setting up a new government where the South can be part as well, and figuring out how to rebuild it in that way. And Abraham Lincoln's plan was pretty simple. It was also pretty moderate. He really felt like it was very nice to the people of the South. His plan was to give amnesty to Confederates, to people that were a part of the Confederacy, as long as they swore an oath of loyalty to the United States and accepted the proclamations that had happened that had ended slavery. Okay, so accepting the end of slavery and swearing an oath of loyalty to the United States was enough, and they would get amnesty. An amnesty is just a word for a pardon for a large group. So you're pardoned of your crimes. You don't have to face up to the crimes that you did. Basically, you're free from whatever mistakes that you made before. And so the other part, or the other two parts of the plan, were when 10% of the state had taken the oath. Okay, 10% of the voting population in 1860, so right before the war. If 10% of those people took the oath, they were able to organize and create a new state government in that state. Okay, the only rules were that the Confederate government officials and Confederate military officers were not allowed to take the oath, and were not allowed to be pardoned. Okay, so they needed to stand punishment for what they had done. Lincoln, like I said, had a very moderate plan. It really focused on bringing everybody back together and really coming back together with the South instead of punishing them. And so more radical Republicans started to really gain a lot of power at this time, led by Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania and Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. And they didn't want to reconcile with the South. Instead, they wanted to change the South. They wanted to change all of their institutions, their habits, their manners, everything about them. They wanted to completely change up the South. And really, if you look at it, the radical Republicans had three main goals. First off, they wanted to prevent any Confederate leaders from getting any of their power back at all. They didn't want that to happen. They felt like they were the bad people, the bad guys. You didn't want the bad guys back in power. Secondly, they wanted the Republican Party to become powerful in the South. If they were able to do that, then they could continue to be reelected and things like that. Okay, and then third, connected to that, and the way they did or wanted to do that was they wanted African Americans to be given the right to vote. And so what they realized as this is happening is that the South is probably going to have some more political power now that things have changed a little bit, and that slaves are not seen as slaves but are seen as actual people. They realized that now that the Three-Fifths Compromise was gone, the Three-Fifths Compromise, if you remember from when we talked about it before, is that when it comes to the House of Representatives, the slaves counted as population, but each slave only counted as 3/5 of a person towards the population. So now the House of Representatives was going to have 15 more brand new seats, and all of them would come from the South. And so they knew that the South would actually gain political power out of this whole thing. And so they needed the Republicans to be strong in the South. Okay. And the way they were going to do this is they wanted African American voters to vote. Because if American voters voted, they're going to vote for the Republican Party, the party that freed them from slavery, not the Democratic Party, which didn't take as strong of a stance on slavery. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint 1. Again, while Lincoln was in office, he wanted that plan. Congress did not like that plan because the radical Republicans didn't want it to be so easy on the South. So they put together the Wade-Davis bill in Congress. And the Wade-Davis bill said this. It said that of white males, you needed the majority, or over 50%, to take that oath of allegiance to the Union. And then once you did that, the state could hold a constitutional convention to make a government for themselves. But they had to do 3 things within this constitutional convention. They had to abolish slavery, completely get rid of slavery. They had to reject debts taken on when in the Confederacy. So anything that anybody they had borrowed money from when they were part of the Confederacy, they just weren't going to have to pay them back. They would say, I'm not going to pay you back because that was a different government. They're gone now. And then last, it said that Confederate government officials and military officers will not be allowed to vote or take part in the government. Now, Lincoln didn't like this. He thought it was harsh and it would cause a harsh peace where the South felt punished, and it really wouldn't help what they wanted to do. And so he used a pocket veto to block it. And a pocket veto is simply a president is seeing that we're getting near the end of the term of Congress, and he just doesn't sign the bill. So even though it got through Congress, okay, the president just let it sit and didn't sign the bill until after Congress expired. And once the congressional session expires, a certain amount of days happens. I think it's 10 days after the session, then the bill just goes away and it needs to be brought up again. So that's how Lincoln kind of vetoed, but didn't officially veto the Wade-Davis bill. All right, so then the government started to decide how they were going to help these freed slaves. Okay, and they sent William Tecumseh Sherman down to start to claim and reserve all of the abandoned plantation land within 30 miles of the coast to be used by African Americans. So if it had been left behind, if the owner had died, or they just couldn't handle it anymore because they didn't have slaves or whatever, if it had been given up and abandoned, all of that land within 30 miles of the coast was supposed to be allowed to be used by African Americans. So the Union troops came in and settled about 40,000 African Americans on this land, on this like 500,000 acres of land in this area, okay, in Georgia and South Carolina. Okay, and then also they set up the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to feed and clothe these war refugees, right? These people that used to be slaves and now they're stuck because of the war with nothing. And so they fed and clothed these war refugees in the South using the army supplies that were left over. And this was really important because it helped prevent, for white and black people, it helped prevent this big mass starvation and people dying because they were starving to death in the South. So that just didn't happen after the war. The other things that the Freedmen's Bureau set up was they helped the freedmen get jobs on plantations and talked to the plantation owners, the planters, and negotiated their wages to make sure that they had a fair amount of work that they needed to do and were getting paid a fair amount of money. Okay, they also set up courts to deal with disagreements between the planters and the freedmen themselves. A couple more things the Freedmen's Bureau did. They worked with Northern charities to set up schools, pay teachers, and educate these formerly enslaved people as much as possible. And they did try, but they failed to get land for the freedmen, for every freedman. But Congress just would not support taking away that Confederate land. They felt like that went against the right to property that we have hold dear in America. And you can kind of see this advertisement really interesting, and it shows you kind of what the South people thought about it, and that they still were holding on to this idea of being better than the black man. Okay, it says the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. So saying they get to be lazy and the white man has to pay for it. You know, it was vetoed by the president, and Congress made it a law anyways. If you support the Congress, you support the Negro. Sustain the president, you protect the white man. So it's just this argument about the Freedmen's Bureau and whether it's good or bad. So you can kind of see newspapers from the South are showing you their true colors, and you can see why there might have been quite a bit of arguments at this time, and even leading up to violence. And so when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, became the president. He was from Tennessee, so he was from the South, and he was previously a Democrat before all this fighting and stuff. And so he kind of was on the other side. He was supposed to keep the South happy and keep the Democrats happy and stuff like that. And so it's kind of interesting to see that he also kept that same kind of moderate policy like Lincoln. He didn't want to punish the South. And so the plan they ended up using for a while was Johnson's Restoration Program. Okay, and this one was that there was a pardon given out. Remember that amnesty idea for all the people who took the oath, except for Confederate officials and citizens with property worth more than $20,000. So the very rich and the Confederate officials were not given those pardons. But in order to get these pardons, each state and to become a government would have to do three things. They would have to call a constitutional convention and revoke their secession. So take away the paperwork that said that they had seceded. They also had to ratify the 13th Amendment, okay, so free all the slaves in all of America. And last, again, they had to reject all their debts that they had gotten during the Civil War, okay. And so this was the plan that was used. And so, with all of this happening, in December of 1865, Congress came to session, and they saw that Southern voters had elected a bunch of former Confederate leaders, okay, to come in and be in Congress. But Congress said, we will not seat them. This doesn't count. We have to rethink and restart this whole process again because you guys are just electing these same Confederate leaders that were part of the problem before. Okay, the new governments in the South also started to create something called black codes. Okay, and these black codes were kind of like slavery. They replaced slavery with something that was just like slavery, and they were laws that tried to control the freedmen and allow the plantation owners to kind of exploit them and make them work for little to no money. And it was just, just more of the same the South was doing here. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. So with all of these things that the South was doing, falling back into their own patterns, it led to a lot of the moderate Republicans, a lot of the Republicans, to join in with the radical Republicans. And so the radical Republicans got control and started to develop their own Reconstruction program. Part of this Reconstruction was the 14th Amendment. This gives former slaves equal protection under the law. So it basically says they have all the same rights as anybody else in America, and you can't take away rights based on race. And it, this increased a lot of the problems and violence in the South. The increasing problems in the South and violence really convinced the moderates, the middle of the road people, to pass it or to vote for it, and Congress was able to pass the 14th Amendment. President Johnson didn't like it. He wanted, his plan, but he also saw more violence that was starting to happen in the South, and that started to take over precedence over what he wanted. And so the radical Republicans took complete control of Congress. At this point, they had a 3-1 majority, and the amendment was quickly ratified by 1868, okay, and sent through. And so the 14th Amendment went into the books in 1868. And the radical Republicans set up military reconstruction. They created the Military Reconstruction Act, which divided the former Confederacy, you can see the map right over here, okay, into 5 military districts with a Union general in charge of each district. The only southern state that was not included was Tennessee. Okay, Tennessee was part of the South, but they had already ratified the 14th Amendment, so the North thought, well, they're getting with the program, so we're just going to let them go, but everybody else is going to be put into this strict military control. And the southern states, they said, needed another constitutional convention, right? And this constitutional convention, what they had to do to become a state was they had to give the right to vote to all adult male citizens, regardless of race, and they had to ratify and send through the 14th Amendment before you were allowed to elect any people into Congress. Okay, so again, by the end of 1868, 6 states had done this and had rejoined the Union, and the 14th Amendment had been ratified. And so the radical Republicans, they knew that President Johnson could easily refuse to enforce any of these laws, right? And I know I wrote endorse there, but it's enforce any of these laws. And so what they needed was a workaround for that. They trusted the Secretary of War to enforce the laws. They also trusted Ulysses S. Grant, who was kind of on the radical side, to kind of follow through with what they were asking. And so they created 2 acts in Congress. First off, the Command of the Army Act, and that said all orders from the president to the Army had to go through the headquarters of the General of the Army, which was Ulysses S. Grant, who they trusted. So any of these orders had to go through someone they trusted. And then the Tenure of Office Act, okay, said that the Senate has to approve removal of any government officials whose appointment they had to consent to. So they had to vote and say it was okay for the Secretary of War to become part of the cabinet. And so now they would have to, or they would have to approve taking him away too. They would have to vote to approve getting rid of him and firing him as well. Johnson didn't like this. He knew that they were trying to work around him, and so President Johnson fired his Secretary of War to challenge the Tenure of Office Act. Okay, 3 days later, Senate voted that they would impeach President Johnson. Remember, impeachment is formally charge a public official with misconduct in office. So this is just the charge saying they did something wrong and we need to do a trial about it. Okay, so then the trial happened and they voted on whether they should remove him from office or not. And the vote to remove him came up 1 vote short of the 2/3 majority that they needed to convict and remove him from office. And Johnson was not removed from office. And the reason that a lot of these people didn't want to vote. The reason why some of these people didn't want to vote to remove him from office was because they thought it would set a dangerous precedent that you are allowed to impeach a president just because they don't agree with what Congress says. And those two need to be separate, and they need to have checks and balances over each other. And so they saw that ahead and did not vote to impeach President Johnson. So the Republicans took a little bit more control in the election of 1868 when President Johnson, who was kind of the one dissenting opinion, did not run for office, and the Republicans instead selected Ulysses S. Grant, who was kind of on that radical Republican side. Okay, the violence in the South had convinced people that the South did need this military supervision that they had planned in order to truly reorganize and bring their governments back. And for that, or because of that, a military man, Grant, won 5 of the Deep South states and many of the northern states. And the Republicans and Grant started to see the importance of the African American voters because it would give them more Republican votes to make the Republican Party stronger. Okay, and so the 15th Amendment was also passed. The 15th Amendment said you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your race. Okay, and 2 years later, enough states had ratified it that they were able to add the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. So the 3 slavery amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the 13th freed the slaves, the 14th gave them this equal protection under the law, and the 15th gave them the right to vote. And those were kind of the slavery amendments that happened during Reconstruction. Now that you've reached the end of your notes, write out 3 questions you have from the notes. If you don't have any, then please create 3 test or quiz questions you might see from this material.